Hi everyone, I'm Alexa Sirbu, co-founder and director at XK.
Hi, I'm Stephan Helbing. I'm 3D artist and designer at XK. And thank you to Side Effects for inviting us once again.
XK is a design and motion practice. We are a team of 10 working from our London studio. And we propose that there is a sensibility to be explored in motion design. And we aim to find the most compelling way to bring it to life.
So today, as you could probably tell from the title, we'll be talking about cops and Houdini, how we use it in our projects, as well as some Gaussian splatting techniques and other fun tools we loved to use in the past year.
Yeah. We will also take you through some of our latest work. But as we now live in a world where making images became so easy with AI, we will also focus on some key mechanisms and mindsets that keep us engaged and excited with what we do, and how, when we detour into unexpected combinations, we find something that's uniquely ours. So, jumping straight in, the first mechanism stems from the ideas and the briefs we decide to work on. And the concepts have to pose some sort of design and abstraction challenge, something that just isn't as straightforward to visualize in 3D. And it gets us thinking creatively as well as technically. For example, the project we did last year for London Symphony Orchestra, it was using brain data to create a world that resembles both a planet but also a human brain. Let's first play the final piece. Thank you. So the brief was capture audience's emotional reaction as they're listening to LSO and create an authentic visual expression responsive to music while building a brain planet. So quite a visual and technical challenge we had in front of us.
This ties back to the fact that the chosen musical piece was Jupiter by Gustav Holst, from an orchestral suite called The Planets. The data itself came from UCL Ear Institute in London, who were also partners on this project. They used EEG to track emotional response of an audience member while listening to the orchestra, and then passing the data on to us to implement it in Houdini. And this is what it looked like when we first got it. A bunch of numbers and a CSV file. And before doing anything else, we quickly wanted to try and find a way to visualize it in Houdini to see what we are actually working with.
While, on the other hand, when working with abstracting and combining two unrelated subjects, our first step was trying to find these common visual traits between the two, such as swirls in the structure of a brain versus the turbulent clouds in a planet, or neural pathways under a microscope versus river networks seen from the sky. We also broke down the exploration stage into these main creative components, we call them, because we do not have a typical storyboard. Instead, we want to explore these different territories and see what interesting visual moments we can find, bearing in mind those connections. Because if we were to draw a storyboard at this point, it would collapse all other possibilities and restrict us too much. But we still had a rough framework and narrative arc on how we envisioned the film to develop in terms of the tempo, the build-up, and the main chapters. So we set off exploring areas within each of those components, starting with the planetary terrain, playing with this level of scale, creating something that could be both microscopic, but also from further away, it could be seen as a planetary landscape. And obviously, the problem is that there is no actual landscape on Jupiter. So we had to make a lot of stuff up and draw inspiration from other planets and references.
We were also looking into how these ribbon landscapes could be inspired by the swirly atmosphere on Jupiter, or how the rivers would relate to the neural pathways, with the texture and the detail hinting at landscapes, while the motion was implying a synapse activity. And this is where we injected the data and spawn it where the rivers propagate, using some Houdini magic to grow these rivers over the landscape, which relates to where the activity is happening in the brain. We also spent quite a bit of time exploring the vapor and cloud elements, which is quite obvious since Jupiter is a gas planet. We were using some real images of the Jupiter atmosphere to emit the smoke from it, but also exploring the swirly nature of these atmospheres, since that is what would relate to the structure of the brain.
So yeah, when assembling all of those elements coming from the R&D together into something that has to look both a brain and a planet, we did several trials, designed these bespoke inner structures that the landscape would wrap on. And once packing it with the rivers and the vapor, we felt that we were getting somewhere, but we weren't really getting that brain and the feeling of cosmic scale that we were trying to get to. However, once we started to introduce symmetry for this inner layer, the brain was a lot more recognizable. And when colliding it against like an outer shell, it was giving a bit more of a planetary feel. It's very rough R&D tests, but yeah, we layered several of those elements. We set it against this backdrop, and it felt like we were finally starting to get something that was hinting at Jupiter.
So for the end shot reveal, we decided to have this zoom out, starting from inside the planet, packing the smoke and landscapes with grains and detail, aligning the colors. And when assembling all the elements together, we arrive at the final shot that you see in the film. So looking back, the fun and satisfaction comes from solving all of these abstraction challenges as we go. Because it would have been very hard to arrive at these results by purely prompting for inspiration or shortcutting through the process. It's in the tinkering with the ideas and the unexpected combinations where we feel that our values lie.
And yeah, this process that we have leads us on to the next mindset, relating to the way we use technology, or Houdini, or whichever tool we have at hand. We see it more of a dance than a rigid pipeline, this back and forth between having control versus letting go of that control, and also not always using the tools in the way they are intended.
This leads us onto COPS, which is one of the new technologies in Houdini that we are really excited about. Currently, it's intended to be used primarily for texture generation, and its ability to combine procedural and image-based data into texture maps makes it a super powerful tool. A different use case is image processing. We can apply filtering and effects over already rendered elements. Combining it with other areas of Houdini is also super fun. And since everything is happening in the same software, it's really easy to go from a 2D image to a height field, for example. Shout out to Paul Estonch. But we were curious, and we wanted to push COPS into areas you wouldn't usually use it for. So we were experimenting with placing the COP network inside of a solver to get these iterative 2D simulations.
And yeah, this was happening while doing the R&D for this swatch project that you see on the screen. We were working with a series of very vibrant watches featuring these minimal soft gradients. And we wanted to keep that simplicity of the watch design in the direction of all the visuals as well, and find a bold and effective way to celebrate color, while also speaking to the idea of mixology and the combination of liquid, but keeping everything quite clean and soft. So this technique of trailing that edge lends itself quite nicely to the project. And next we're going to show a quick breakdown of how we made this in COPS.
We first take a rendered animation of the watch that we import into a COPNet, so we can reference it inside the solver. And what's inside the solver? Well, there is another COPNet, which is where the simulation is taking place, together with some nulls, so we can fetch the feedback and the current frame of the animation. Inside of the COPNet, we have a few different things taking place, which are grouped into different categories to make it easier to see what's happening. On the very left, we are importing the feedback and the current frame of the animation, as well as an alpha channel, which is used to cut out the watch from the footage. For the sake of simplicity, all other things are disabled, so if we hit play, nothing happens, because the same frame gets feedbacked over and over. If we then cut out the animation by the alpha channel and merge it over itself, we are getting this repetition effect. This on its own isn't very exciting, but from here on we can modify the underlying layers each frame, which is what the section in purple is doing. Here we are shifting colors, tweaking brightness values, and blurring the image, so it slowly evolves and fades out over time. But the most fun is definitely this last section here, marked in green, where we are generating displacement vectors and using them to distort the watch each frame. This is what gives it the fluid-like motion. And you can get really creative here and use all sorts of input data for this. In our example, we are blurring the alpha channel and generating vectors from it using the slope direction node. This will push the pixels outwards. And we are blending that with a noise, which is driven by the current feedback. So it generates shapes that are swirling around the primary structures in the image. Lastly, we can import our simulation into another COPNet outside the solver and add some final tweaks like color changes and effects. And yeah, this is basically how we arrived at this result. And once we discovered this technique on Swatch, of course we had to try it on other projects as well. For example, this here is a piece we created around the same time for Shiseido.
The idea with Shiseido was to take a real flower and distort it just in several parts to give it this more surreal feel. And we tried that technique, and even though it was looking quite interesting to use it exactly like that, we felt that it needed a bit more physicality and realism to the trail rather than purely stretching those edge pixels and getting that 2D look. So instead, we took the concept more as an inspiration to then detour into another technique where we scattered actual points onto that petal, then used the particle system to animate them, and then deformed the petal back with it, arriving at a very different look in the end. So this approach of not staying rigid to the software, but letting it surprise us, helps us discover new looks which we wouldn't have thought of before. And now, despite that a lot of the look comes from experimentation, that does not mean it lacks intention. And we talk about this a lot, but the aesthetic, the colors, that hyper-real tactility, and the simulations are not a pure stylistic decision or an end in themselves. We use them in order to evoke a certain emotion.
And yeah, all these colors, textures, intricacy or fidelity of a surface or a simulation are always carefully crafted in order to evoke a familiar feeling or spark a reaction in the audience. And the way that we do this varies. From meticulously scanning and replicating real-world objects, such as what we did for our collaboration with Issey Miyake, taking ingredients found within the fragrance, scanning them and bringing them back into Houdini. But it's always not stopping at reality, but pushing it further into more of our own territory of surrealism and hypertactility. But also injecting ordinary objects, such as grains of salt, with life and magic on their own.
And the idea for the Issey Miyake film was to build a choreographic dance where the salt and all of the ingredients come alive. So we used pyro quite a bit and morphed between these different cymatic patterns, advecting the salt particles with it. And as always, when it comes to simulations, it's this back and forth between giving clear guidance of what those particles should do, but also leaving it up to the solver and the forces and being surprised. And I'll now play the final piece. Good. Thank you. And moving on to another project where the emotion and the feeling was a key part of it is the work we did for Sophie, which must be also our favorite and biggest project from last year. It was a dream project, to be honest, creating music visualizers, album visualizers, and cover artworks for her last album. And for the very few people who aren't familiar with her, she was a groundbreaking artist whose sound redefined what pop and electronic music means. So we were very honored as big Sophie fans to take on this opportunity and working closely with Sophie's family and art director Renata Raksha to create this world. And we have to give credit to Renata for these incredible mood boards and initial style frames she came to us with. We were already quite inspired just by seeing this and how aligned it was with what we love to create. So we had in front of us unique visualizers for 3 songs, which meant about 14 minutes of output to produce, which is a lot more than the 30-second film we're used to. And if you look at how other music visualizers are approached, they usually have to be very repetitive and formulaic. And for us, we didn't want to sacrifice the emotional aspect and wanted the viewer to be engaged in as much unique imagery as possible. So we decided to treat them almost like individual music videos and craft them the same way as we would all our other work. Just do it in a much shorter timeline, but somehow not sacrifice the quality or the rendering. But most importantly, we wanted to induce this euphoric and transcending feeling of her sound, staying true to the Sophie universe, almost like witnessing one of her live shows, which is absolutely bonkers, but in space. So for our first track, Reason Why, the emotions and themes were ethereal and everlasting, space, latex, dust, pink lasers, and ultra-shiny surfaces. We'll play a cut down of the final music video. Thank you. And the second one was titled One More Time. And that was a deconstructed and robotic Berlin techno club in space. I'll play the song. One more time. 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 Thank you. You can watch the full visualizers, by the way. But yeah, here we had a lot of fun building these mechanical parts that would unfold and interact with shiny, stretching vellum cloth or cables. And an interesting shot was that robotic arm for which we modeled and individually animated several pieces that would fit that industrial aesthetic that we were going for. And then those were placed onto an unrolling Kinefx arm, where the scale of each joint is used to control the sequence of each piece. And that created this illusion of an infinitely growing robotic arm. And here is that final shot again. And now for the last song, which was called Exhilarate. The idea was a space odyssey tracing the birth of the universe, organic matter, volcanoes, planets, and galaxies. And I'll play a cut down.
I spend all my moments caught in the middle, up way too high, under the water, testing my luck, or trying to be stable.
Thank you. So yeah, at the heart of what we do remains this emotion and this feeling of surprise that we chase and the obsession that we have for seeing it sparked in other people.
And if you know us and if you've seen our past talks, another one of our obsessions is flowers, which was a consistent theme since the very beginning. So we'd like to take this opportunity to talk about our latest obsession, which is 3D Gaussian splatting. To summarize it briefly, Gaussian splatting is a very efficient technique for representing 3D scenes as lots of tiny blurred points instead of traditional vertices and polygons. You might have heard of it in the context of 3D scanning. And the great thing about this new technology is that the scans are rather quick to make and can produce very detailed and realistic looking results, particularly for flowers, which is what we've been scanning quite a bit. So naturally, we've been quite hooked by this new innovation and the possibilities that come along with it. And what we're showing here is more like an initial playground of setups and ideas, things that we thought could be interesting to do with the scan data inside of Houdini. Of course, we have to mention the amazing GSOPS toolkit here, which is a collection of Houdini nodes for importing, editing, and displaying Gaussian splats directly in the viewport. The scan data comes as a point cloud with a bunch of attributes on the points, which you can morph and manipulate in unexpected ways. Like in this example, which almost looks like the cop trails, but in 3D space. We first want to convert the point cloud into a mesh, and for this we start by copying spheres onto the points, converting everything into a VDB and smoothing it, which gives us one connected geo that we can use for simulation or different interactions with other objects. Afterwards, we create a vellum cloth from it and simulate that with some wind force to get a basic motion. Transferring that to the original point cloud with a pointy form gives us an animated Gaussian splat. Different areas of the scan have this animated noise, which we use to isolate the points. That is where the trail effect is happening. And by iterating over these points in a feedback loop, we can offset them and shift different attributes like the color or opacity. And what really makes it blend together nicely is by visualizing everything with the Gaussian splat source node. That way, all the point cloud data gets rendered directly in the viewport, which is really cool to play with. And inside this feedback loop here, we are displacing the points by the noise and shifting the hue and alpha attribute, which gives us this trail effect. Next, we're going to show a very quick breakdown of this orchid scene. And I'll have to give a shout out here to David Lisser, who made this beautiful scan. If you want to have the flowers interacting with other elements, we first need to turn the point data into a mesh. This is again done by copying spheres on the points. And since the Gaussian splat comes with all these attributes for rotation and scale, it already gives us a good approximation of what the surface of the object looks like. To convert this into a usable geometry, we VDB mesh it all together and apply some filtering to smooth out the irregular shapes. If you want to get a really clean result, it can sometimes be a good idea to transfer the position of the original point cloud back onto the mesh. That way we can dial back the inflation that comes from the VDB, and it can help in areas with really fine details. For simulating this orchid, we won't need lots of resolution, so we can poly reduce it down. This is also the part where we create all the different groups and attributes that can be useful in Vellum to control pin constraints, stiffness of the material, and areas where forces will be applied. When everything is simulated, we get the slight movement of the petals in the wind, which is going to be used to point deform the scan. From there, we can layer on other simulations. Flip is always quite fun to combine with flowers. So we are scattering points on the meshed scan and animating a noise over it to drive where the fluid is emitting from. And injecting a swirly turbulence in the simulation gives us the splashy fluid sim. If you want to render the Gaussian splat point cloud and the fluid in one scene, we can use Karma. There is a great video called 3D Gaussian Ray Tracing by Oliver Markowski on YouTube that explains this technique for anybody interested. It uses the instancer to copy spheres on the points and some clever vector math in the shader to render the splat. Alternatively, we also built a different rendering setup here, where the idea is to find the shortest axis of each point scale attribute and scaling that component to 0. So when you copy boxes onto the points, they will be scaled down in one axis and essentially turn into planes. That gives us a geometry which can be rendered in any engine. For example, this scene right here is built in Octane, and you can see the scans reacting to other elements and the lighting, almost as if they were real meshes. And this is done by giving each plane a radial texture, which is multiplied by the alpha attribute to set the material's opacity, also putting the point color into the color of the material, and mixing in some emission to get a bit of the lighting from the original scan back. And although this method is not as accurate as the Karma setup, it gives a rather quick and easy solution to combine Gaussian splats with other 3D elements in the scene. And here's a collection of some of these flower scans rendered with this technique. So, wrapping everything up, these are the projects that have kept us busy over the past year, and the mindset and practices that have quietly guided our process along the way, helping us feel excited rather than being overwhelmed by the fast pace of the industry.
And yes, we started the presentation with a reel of our work, and we felt that it would only make sense to end it with a reel of the team behind the work, without who none of this would have been possible. So a big shout out to the XK team. And now I'd like to take you from here in Barcelona all the way into our studio in London.
Thank you.
I must mention that video was also done in Houdini. So yeah, thank you Side Effects for inviting us again, and all of you for coming. Hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you.
Incroyable. Amazing work. Thank you for taking us through that. Any questions? Yeah.
That was an amazing talk. So in the Issey-Miyake project, you had like the particles, I'm not sure what it's called, but it's like when you make sounds like a metal plate, it creates these fractal kind of patterns. did you make those in COPs and then use like some sort of like attraction for the particles, or did you do that in a different way?
Oh, those were splines. So we designed the cymatic patterns as splines and then used that for the particles to attract them. Yeah, that was in COPs. It could have been.
Other questions? Yeah.
Sorry, Greg.
That's fine.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. Amazing work. I'm really interested into using external sources of data in Houdini, and I like the project, the Brain Planet, the first one. I was wondering, how do you go about deciding how to use the external data from the electroencephalogram into driving the animations in the video? For example, the camera movements or the rhythm of the video, cutting or triggering noise attributes or whatever?
Yes, well, the data that we got from them, to be honest, it was quite overwhelming because they were tracking so many things, almost the heartbeat, the temperature, the sweat. So we had quite a lot of data. And then when creatively we were trying to decide, okay, what's the most effective way? Because most of the data would be just like these bursts of where in the brain the activity is happening. So we thought almost like the accent of the visual would be the rivers and all of these like light-based effects that would stand out. So that's where we almost took the highest spike from all that data that we got and mapped it onto the position of those rivers onto the brain sort of 3D mesh and the location. But yeah, we luckily had the freedom and trying to find like the most effective and like visually interesting way to take that data. So yeah, I hope that answers it.
Yeah, thanks.
Other questions?
No.
I'm looking around. Going once, going twice. Well, very good presentation. Thank you so much, Stephan and Alexa.